March 24th, 2005, the US version of The Office aired for the first time, and while it did very well right off the bat, the first season of the show is a far cry from what it would eventually become. The majority of the characters in the first season of the show changed drastically throughout the series. Michael becomes a caring boss, standing up to his best friend who's insulting his girlfriend. Dwight becomes a competent manager, considering just about everyone in the office to be his best friends and family. And Jim, well, Jim's a different story. That's why today we're going to go through the series to talk about Jim Halpert and his character arc. Or perhaps lack of character arc. And I guess consider this your official spoiler warning for a show we talk about a solid amount. And hey, while we're here, subscribe down below to stay up to date on everything we're putting out. Let's start at the beginning of the series, because, well, it's the beginning. In the very first episode, we get a taste of what's to come from Jim through basically the entire series. We see him being sarcastic and witty, mostly towards Dwight, we see him doing his typical pranking hijinks against Dwight, and we see him flirting with Pam, though she is at this point engaged to Roy, but more on that in a bit. Now let's fast forward to the second to last episode of the series. In this episode, we see Jim being sarcastic and witty, mostly towards Dwight, who is now the manager. We see him pranking Dwight by convincing Dwight to be his assistant's assistant, and we see a love-filled DVD that Jim gives to Pam. Through the entire series, aside from a couple rare instances, Jim doesn't really change who he is as a person. I mean, the only thing about Jim that is constantly changing and evolving is his hair.
You got a haircut. It's sexy, hot.
Oh.
Turn around.
No.
Come on.
No, thanks.
Do it!
This would mean that Jim falls into the category of being a static character, or a character who doesn't really change throughout the series. But despite this, he's still a very round and very well-developed character as a whole. We know what Jim wants, we know what Jim loves, but we know that Jim isn't really ever going to change who he is. And we get some pretty solid evidence of that in the show. In Season 3, Jim moves to Dunder Mifflin's Stanford branch after finally accepting that Pam was going to marry Roy. While this could give Jim a lot of room to grow as a character and person, this is cut short when the Stanford branch is absorbed back into the Scranton branch, and Jim, now dating Karen, is brought back to Pennsylvania. Jim, despite continuing to prank Dwight while in Stanford, has decided to try and grow up, at least a little, though he does find himself unable to resist the chance to prank Dwight when given even the slightest opportunity from Pam. This is one of the few times we see Jim trying to change, but basically being unable to. The other major time we see Jim really attempting to change his ways would be when he is named co-manager of the Scranton Dunder Mifflin branch. Though for much of this he is on his honeymoon, and he immediately reverts back to his old ways when demoted back to salesman. Now let's move on to talking about the Jim and Pam relationship. One of Jim's main character traits is actually his love for Pam, despite them taking 4 seasons to actually begin to date. But it is important to realize that Jim doesn't really force himself to change to get to this point. Quite the opposite, actually. Jim is basically offered Jan's old job, but decides to turn it down in order to be with Pam. Which, while incredibly sweet, prevents him from leaving his comfort zone and leads to him kind of accepting his life in Scranton. It's kind of weird that Jim doesn't really need to grow or change as a character in order to begin his relationship with Pam, when she actually has to go through a lot as a person in order to grow and become the person who eventually decides to be with Jim. For Pam, this is most prominently seen in Season 3's episode, Beach Games, where Pam finally grows sick of being a background character in her own life, walks across a bed of hot embers, and decides to voice her opinion and be more assertive for the first time in her life. This is huge for Pam, and it does actually lead to the beginning of their relationship. We can see more from Pam fully getting over Roy and discovering her self-worth throughout the season. Alternatively, Jim leaves his girlfriend in New York, drives to Scranton, and asks Pam out. The only other bit of growth that we see from Jim through the series is him eventually considering Dwight to be a friend. Though I'm not too sure how much learning to not be a dick can be considered a major character arc. But let's be fair and talk about it. As we've stated earlier, Jim and Dwight have some pretty predictable interactions through the series. Dwight does something weird, Jim makes a comment, eggs Dwight on, or does a Jim look at the camera. Though there are a few exceptions, with my favorite being the Christmas episode where Dwight challenges Jim to a snowball fight and turns the table on their usual dynamic. But the biggest moment in the Jim and Dwight relationship comes when the two of them are in Florida trying to set up a saber store. Jim learns that Dwight is going to be used as a fall man, and initially, he tries to get Dwight to give up on his position working on the saber store in order to keep his job back in Scranton. After trying and failing for all of 20 seconds, Jim gives up, and after being guilted by Pam, he goes back and forcibly removes Dwight, saving his friend. This is the biggest growth we see from Jim, and he wouldn't have even done it if it wasn't for Pam guilting him into it. But after this point, Jim and Dwight have a deeper level of respect for each other. Now let's talk more about static characters as a whole. As I stated earlier, a static character by definition is a character who does not change over time. This fits Jim to a T. But it is important to realize that this doesn't mean he was poorly written. Quite the contrary, in fact. Jim is an incredibly complex and well-defined character. When put into a situation, it's not hard to sit back and think, now what's Jim gonna do here? Because we understand his character so well. And it's important to remember that many of our favorite characters of all time are static characters themselves. Sherlock Holmes, in the books, not in most of the TV shows, most iterations of James Bond, and Indiana Jones. Jim doesn't change because he doesn't need to. He might tone down his inner office hijinks, but that doesn't mean he's actively changing as a person. And that's okay. But anyways, this has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. I'm trying this out as a new possible series where I look more into characters from different shows like The Office, Parks and Rec, Always Sunny, or anything like that. Let me know what you think and if you'd like to see more videos along this line. Follow me on Twitter at 10KBill, support us on our Patreon if you like the show and want to see more like it. Comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next. And of course, make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment related content.